Did any of the following actually happen as described in these scary stories? I hid from a giant dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've been staying in a tiny apartment in Michigan since early 2020, but last week I went to visit my parents for a couple of weeks in upstate New York. First of all, I want to point out the irony that I had to leave Michigan to see my first dogman. Second of all, I want to reiterate, I saw a dogman in upstate New York. I left Michigan for New York City first. I didn't even have time to go outside and see the snow falling there before I had to catch my Metro North connection up to my parents' house. It wasn't really the house I grew up in, but we moved there when I was 14, and I did have some good memories of the place and some friends among the neighbors. Once the train went above ground, I was glad I had a window seat because I got to watch it snow the entire trip up there. I mostly enjoy the snow. I don't even mind shoveling it. This time, for whatever reason, I particularly enjoyed it, and I couldn't wait to get outside and into it again. I resolved to take the route from the station through the woods to the back of my parents' home, rather than catching a cab or having them pick me up, and I texted them to let them know my plans. They were cool with it, but asked me to text before leaving the station. If I took more than an hour to reach them, they then had my permission to get worried. My parents worry about everything. Then they ask me permission to worry about me too. It's to relieve their guilt about worrying about me, but it makes me feel guilty and worry about them. I once considered going into psychotherapy, but I quit after half of one semester once I began realizing how crazy my family and I are. I'm telling you this up front, so that you can go ahead and not believe my story if you don't want to. I was raised to feel guilty about destroying people's paradigms with my truth bombs, so please know that I don't mind if you call me crazy, or even if you call me a liar. I'm not going to insist on the reality of any of this, except to say that it sure seemed real to me when it happened. There's one part in particular coming up that I myself can't explain, and maybe that part proves that I'm not completely together in my head. I'll leave that for you to decide, and I think you'll know what part I'm talking about when we get there. So let's get back to me arriving at the Metro North station near where my parents live, and finding it still snowing out. It was that nice kind of snow that wafts to the ground, swirling around in the light breeze in giant flakes, in much the same way the tree leaves were doing only a short while back. I have to say that the fresh air smelled so good once I reached the trees that it was very nearly intoxicating. The forest smells much better than my apartment. Just trust me on that. I was really enjoying being out in nature, in the snow particularly. I don't even know why. Maybe it was just because I had spent too much time indoors over the past year. Whatever the origin of my contentment, I was feeling truly and completely in a state of bliss. The cold didn't feel that cold, and I took my time wandering through the trees toward the little road that would lead me to my parents' house. I was in no rush to get to it, as I was having so much fun just watching where I was going, if you can believe that. I wished my parents lived twice as far away, as I was missing my walk in those woods before it had even ended. And then, when I came upon the road, bam, with zero warning, there was an enormous beast walking down the center of it. It was the first thing I saw, and I took a step or two back in order to let it pass. I was really hoping it would not see me, because this creature's size compared to mine would be similar to the size difference between me and a squirrel. I'll get to describing what kind of a giant beast this was, but I think it's important to stress that in the initial moments of the encounter, none of that mattered. Some hairy thing, the size of an elephant, was mere feet away from me and heading in a path crossing over mine. That was what my body and I were instinctually reacting to. I wasn't even at the point yet of thinking consciously about what I should do. My instincts told me that something that much bigger than I am was probably going to eat me, and even if not, he, she, or it could injure me or worse, just by accident. I stood behind some kind of a sign, like a caution sign or something. I just remember holding onto the metal post that the sign was attached to, and I remember standing still behind it, as though that made sense as a hiding spot. I was fully in view, but so terrified that I froze into place, nearly becoming one with the signpost that my ungloved hand was holding on to. I remember looking up, wet snow landing on my hoodie, as I gazed upon the great beast there, above me. It was a creature somewhat like a dog, but nothing like a dog. It walked with a mostly bipedal gait, but it kept resting on one or the other of its long front arms, and then peering left or right into the woods. It seemed to be searching for something, but I was not privy to what. When I froze behind the signpost, it turned its Tyrannosaurus-sized head in my direction, and I know you won't believe me, but I left my body. I am not speaking figuratively. I mean, I suddenly found myself looking down on the scene below me in the snow. I saw myself, and I saw every detail about the Dogman or whatever the creature was. It was as though I were flying above the events taking place beneath me, and yet I could also witness them from all angles at once. The immense canine indeed had a head the size of a Tyrannosaurus skull, but the resemblance to the famous thunder lizard of the deep past ends there. Covered in a brownish-gray fur over most of its body, the creature was most definitely not a dinosaur or reptile or bird. It appeared very mammalian. I suppose it might also have been a marsupial, but this was a male, and unlike any living creature I've ever witnessed before. The aforementioned long front arms ended not in dog paws, but in what I can only compare to monster hands from movies I've seen online. Do you know how they'll give movie vampires and werewolves these long claws at the ends of their fingers? This was an awful lot like that, but they looked hard and sturdy like Wolverine's claws. In other words, these fingernails were not going to get bent backward. They were more solid than human fingernails, and they looked like they would be fierce weapons if used in battle. There were so many ways I could see that the Dogman could have snuffed out my life that I could talk on that subject for a half hour. I'm sure you can fill in the blanks yourself, though. I mean, it was so large that it could have just sat on me and finished me off as simply as that. How big was this creature? It's kind of hard to say since I never saw it really standing up fully. It was kind of almost walking the way I've seen some gorillas do it, using their front arms for balance. This was not completely that kind of a walk though, as he only really leaned on one arm at a time, and only when bending over a bit to try to look through the trees for whatever it was searching for. Then it would lift up onto its two hind legs and walk for a step or two, still hunched over a bit, and then land on the opposite arm from the time before, bending down far enough to be under the tree cover, and search some more for whatever its personal MacGuffin was on that night. If it had stood up tall, its head would have been above the lower end of the tree canopy. I don't in fact know that it could stand up tall like a human, since I did not see it do so. However, the fact that he only seemed to rely on the front arms for balance individually, and only when lowering his eyes to hunt for something, seems to me to imply that, if unfettered, he would normally walk upright and fully bipedally. I'm not a biologist, I'm a layman, however. I'm not an expert on anything. My mom says my dad is a jack of all trades and an expert of none, but she says I'm a jack of no trades, but an expert in his own mind. And that's where I was, in my own mind, no longer feeling the cold, looking down on what I used to think of as myself beneath. I watched from above as the Dogman turned in the direction of my body down there, which was still holding on to the street sign and still looking up at the Dogman. I watched as the Dogman bent over and looked into the forest above and past my body. And then I watched as the Dogman lifted back up onto its two hind legs to advance another couple of steps before repeating the process, looking in the opposite direction. It was so tall and so intent on whatever it was looking for that it either never noticed my body standing down there, or else it just didn't care about it. I think it looked over my head by a few feet, and since I was standing so still, I think it just didn't make note of me, but I guess I'll never really know for sure completely. Whatever it was on the lookout for, it wasn't a guy wearing a dark gray hoodie. That's where that scene just cuts off suddenly for me. I don't know what happened next, to be honest. The next thing I do remember, I was walking through a clearing in the trees into my parents' backyard, just exactly where I had intended to end up. It was as though I were waking up while walking. I don't know exactly what to compare the sensation to. Maybe my body walked robotically home, and my spirit only re-entered at the moment when I remember coming back to consciousness. If so, where was my mind during that period? I don't remember watching myself walking beneath me, and I don't remember being in my body and walking either. I don't know much about out-of-body experiences, so I can only guess. Maybe I was so stressed in my body that I went into a state of shock, forcing my consciousness to exit and float above. Maybe then, once the dinosaur-sized Dogman had passed me and the danger was over, I had re-entered my body. But then suppose the body was still in a state of shock, still in the state that caused my consciousness to exit in the first place. Well, then maybe all my consciousness could manage to do in that instance was make my legs start walking toward home. Remaining where I was, my body would have eventually gotten ill or died of exposure. Moving me toward home would not only save the organism, but also remove my mind from stress, helping it escape being frozen in shock. Maybe the sight of my parents' back porch was the only thing that was going to really wake me up again, and I was guided back by the higher aspect of my consciousness, whatever that means exactly. Or, maybe I just got lucky. But in any case, I'm grateful I got to live another day. I'm happy that I get to tell you now about the night that I hid from a giant Dogman. Don't go anywhere, we've got another all-new Dogman story to tell you, but first, I'd like to thank today's executive producer, Helen Ivanov. Not since the Helen of the Troy has a Helen brought so much joy. I cannot even think of a Helen as nice as Ivanov. Please join us in thanking Helen Ivanov for making this episode possible. In return, we share with her our secret uncensored stories that come out each Sunday night. Stories far too wild to ever tell on this channel, and you can see them too. All you have to do is either join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com or do what Helen Ivanov did and click the join link below. And now, for our second Dogman story of the day, the Dogman of Scandinavia. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I bet I'm the first person to send you a story about a werewolf-type entity seen in Scandinavia. I'm talking about Scandinavia, Wisconsin, of course. Specifically, I'm talking about the area called Jorgens Park Preserve. I was driving on Route 49 one snowy night recently, and I was over near the bowling alley when I saw this weird-looking man walking toward the road from the direction of Silver Lake. It was a cold night, but this guy seemed to be drenched and dripping wet. I thought he was wearing animal pelts or a fur coat or something, but the better I got to see him, the more I became alerted to the fact that this wasn't a man at all. I felt this feeling that brought on deja vu. I'm trying to remember other times I've felt this in my life, but I'm drawing a blank. It was like reality itself were pulling the rug out from underneath me. I had already glanced at this guy a few times from a distance and been certain it was a man walking through the snow toward the road I was driving on. Then I looked again, and I understood. It was something very different. The amount of assumptions I had to make in order to have this monster seem like a man, to me, are just embarrassing. I had heard of the Dogman, but I didn't connect that word to what I was looking at until I got home later and tried to search for what I might have seen. I remembered seeing that old Super 8mm film of a Dogman from back in the 20th century. I remember that turned out to be a hoax. It was a guy in a ghillie suit running on all fours down a hill. So that was kind of what I thought Dogman looked like. A guy in a ghillie suit running on all fours. This was not like that. This was a creature that stood up on its hind legs and walked on those two alone. It had long fur all over, dripping wet as though it just had a swim, and it had a crazy-looking dog head. Maybe not a dog exactly, but something similar to a dog. It was making these sounds, these vocalizations that I was not hearing inside my sealed car with music playing. When it did so, however, it would open its mouth ridiculously wide, in a way that reminded me of an old film I had seen of the supposedly extinct thylacine. This was not a striped creature, however, or else its wetness had darkened the fur too much for me to see the stripes at night. I am only comparing how wide it opened its mouth to the thylacine, nothing else about it. It walked in a somewhat zombified manner across the snow, just staring forward in a fixed way. It's not like it had its arms out in front of it like Frankenstein, but it's not like it didn't either. After I knew this wasn't a normal guy, I kept doing double and triple takes because I was wondering what kind of costume that person might be wearing. My brain was jumping back and forth all over the place because I wasn't really sure what was heading toward me. You have to remember, this was the size of a man. It was not a giant creature. I wasn't sure how the head mask would fit over a guy's head, and I wondered if the cosplayer's head were actually down in the creature's chest. The arms moved too naturally for that, though. If it was a costume or a puppet, it looked completely real from my continually changing point of perspective. That doesn't mean it was real, but it sure did look real. I've gone to see Penn and Teller perform, and even after they explained this one trick to the audience, I still didn't understand how they did it. I learned that night that I can be fooled. My eyes can be tricked. So when I was looking at what sure seemed to be a dog-headed Bigfoot, I kept wondering how someone was tricking me into thinking I was seeing that. I began to get the sinking feeling that this creature, whatever it was going to get to the road in front of me, and I did not want to find out what would happen in that situation. I began to cautiously accelerate, nervous because I wasn't certain that parts of the road ahead of me might not be as wet as that approaching Dogman appeared to be. I didn't want to skid out and smash up because I was so afraid of this apparent monster. After all, the dog-headed wet creature man hadn't even looked in my direction yet as far as I had noticed. Slowing down might have made more sense than speeding up under the circumstances, but the idea of deliberately allowing that creature to get onto the black tar in front of me was very unappealing. It would be allowing the Dogman to decide what happened next. That might be fine if it turned out he was just on his way to the other side of the road. But if he was a kind of creature that was intolerant toward humans, he looked strong enough to rip his way into my car. So I chose to step down on the gas instead of letting up, and I placed my fate in the hands of... fate? I guess so. Better than placing my fate in the Dogman's monster hands. Well, I crashed up, and I died. This is my ghost telling you the story. No, I got past the Dogman, obviously, passing him just as he walked his zombified walk out of the snow and mud and grass alongside the road and onto the road itself. That thing had dog feet. It did not have Bigfoot feet as I had expected to see. I thought it was a Bigfoot body with a dog head walking on its toes through the mud. At that last second, though, as I was passing it, I was able to see that its legs were bent in that different way that dog or cat or deer or goat legs are bent. The hind legs, I mean. It looked like it had large dog paws as its feet, not what I had been imagining was moving through that snow. I glanced once or twice into my rear view mirror before it was out of my sight. The dripping wet thing had never once looked at me. For all I know, I saw a ghost reenacting its final walker or something like that. Assuming it was a living, breathing creature existing in three-dimensional reality where it appeared to be that night, maybe it was freezing to death, and that's why it was walking in that manner. Maybe it knew where it needed to get to in order to dry off and warm up, and maybe that took precedence in its mind over chasing prey or barking at my car, or even exerting the energy to look in my direction. That might be the simplest answer, if you assume that the existence of a creature such as what I've described is just a simple matter to accept. There's not one mainstream zoologist who would agree with you, of course. In fact, I still would rather be on their side. I mean, on the side of the people who say Dogman or werewolves cannot possibly exist. I would far prefer that someone came out of hiding and admitted it was them, then demonstrated to us how they faked the appearance of an upright walking Dogman that night. I would shake their hand and buy them a beer. No hard feelings. That's because it would be so much easier to get through life knowing I got pranked than having to accept the reality of the Dogman of Scandinavia, Wisconsin.
Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it. You can become a channel member by clicking the join link below. Then you can check our community page to find the links to 10 hours or more of secret, uncensored Dogman stories too wild to be told on this channel. Your other option is to join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com. That's Peter's homemade club, where he will personally email you the links as well as occasional secret club messages. You may also be included as an executive producer in a future episode. Do you have a scary experience you want to tell us about? You can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com, or else call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LESS-SCARY. The machine cuts off every few minutes, so if you have a long story, please keep calling back and we'll piece it together later on. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.